Today's daf is Menachos daf Ayin Aleph, and we are 17 lines from the bottom of daf Ayin Amid Beis, the two dots, Va'asurin b'chadash milifnei HaPesach. Today's daf is being learned as a schos refuah shalema. V'chava Miriam bas Malka Freda, Shlomo ben Chayaleah, Baruch Yitzchak ben Shifra Mirel, Rachel bas Henya, and Edel Nechama bas Batsheva. So we're moving along in the sixth parak of Maseches Menachos, parak Rabbi Yishmael, discussing halachos related to the Karban Omer, the Shtei Halechem, and more generally, the Isser Chadash. So the Mishnah on the bottom of Daf Ayin Amud Aleph said that there are 5 different grains that are subject to the Isser Chadash. Chitin, Sa'orin, Kusmin, Shiboiles, Shual, and Shifai. It's mavur in the sugya that these are the same 5 grains that are subject to the laws of Chala. These are also the same 5 grains that are subject to the Isser Chametz and that one can use to make matzah. But le'inyanenu, the laws of Chadash apply to these 5 grains. What's the chiddush? You could have thought that the laws of Chadash apply only to Sa'orin. And the reason is, because what was Mater Chadash? It was the Karban Omer. And the Karban Omer was brought from Sa'orin. So that maybe the Isser Chadash is also only Negeya Sa'orin, Kamash Malan, that the Isser Chadash is Negeya Sa'orin, but it's also Negeya the other 4 types of grain. Regardless, the Mishnah said that when we say that the Isser Chadash relates to the 5 types of grains, it means both the Isser Achila of Chadash and the Isser Ktsira of Chadash. So the better well-known Isser as it relates to Chadash is the Isser Achila, meaning Chadash Asam and Atayra, a person is not allowed to eat from the Tfuah HaChadasha until the Karban Omer was brought. The lesser known Isser within the world of Chadash is an Isser Kitsira. One was not allowed to harvest the Tfuah in his field until the Karban Omer was harvested. An Isser Achila and an Isser Ktsira. So the Mishnah that the laws of Chadash relate to the Chameshes Minei Dagan, hen the Isser Achila of Chadash, and hen the Isser Ktsira of Chadash. Now if you look at the Mishnah inside, the Mishnah says, Va'asurin, meaning all 5 minim, are aser b'chadash milifnei HaPesach, until Pesach, umiliktzar, and all 5 minim have an Isser Ktsira, milifnei HaOmer, before the Karban Omer. The Bach, and really it's Mavur from Rashi, and really from the Sugya itself, from the Mishnah through the Gemara that we're going to start with right now, that the Girsa that we have in the Mishnah and the Girsa that we're going to have in Meshach whole Sugya is actually the opposite of the way it's supposed to be. And really the way the Mishnah is supposed to read is Va'asurim b'chadash milifnei ha'omer umiliktzar milifnei ha'pesach. And essentially what the Mishnah is saying is that the Isser Achila of Chadash is milifnei, or Lifnei ha'omer, until the Karban Omer was brought. We know the Karban Omer is what was matter, the Isser Achila of Chadash, umiliktzar, and there's an Isser Kitsira of Chadash, milifnei, or Lifnei ha'pesach, until Pesach. Because what was matter, the Ktsira of Chadash? It was the Ktsira of the Karban Omer. The Ktsira of the Karban Omer, as we're going to see in the Sugya, was done Beleil Tezayin Nisan. So the Karban Omer itself was brought B'Yom Tezayin Nisan. All Karbanos were brought during the day. The Ktsira was done the night before. So Tezayin Nisan is the 2nd day Pesach, which in Eretz Yisrael is the 1st day Chol Hamoed. In Chutz La'aretz, it's Yantav Sheni Shal Galuyos. The night, meaning Matzoi, the first night of Pesach, is when the Ktsira was done, and it was the next day that the Hava of the Karban Omer was done. But here's the point. The point is that you're not allowed to harvest any Tfuah HaChadasha until the Ktsira, the harvesting of the Sa'orim that was ultimately going to be used for the Karban Omer. When was that done? That was done on Motzoi Pesach, which essentially means you were not allowed to do any Ktsira up until Pesach. Pesach itself, you can't do Ktsira, and once Matzoi Pesach comes, at that point, you'll be able to do the Ktsira. Because then you're going to do the Ktsira of the Karban Omer, which will essentially be mata the Ktsira of the Tfuah Chadasha. So the Mishnah says, you want to know what the Issa Ktsira is? It's up until Pesach. Now, of course, you can't do it on Pesach. That's because it's one of the Lamitas Malachis. You anyways wouldn't be able to do it on Pesach. And really, as soon as the first day of Pesach passes, you're going to do the Ktsira of the Karban Omer, which will be matter at that point the Ktsira of the Tfuah Chadasha. Hence, the Mishnah says, you want to know what the Issa Ktsira is? The Issa Ktsira is until Lifnei Pesach. Now, the wording is a little bit tricky. It's because, number one, Lifnei Pesach sounds like Pesach is what's matter. Pesach is not what's matter. What's matter, it is the Ktsira of the Karban Omer. But being that the Ktsira of the Karban Omer was done immediately after the first day Pesach, so therefore we could say Lifnei Pesach, Pesach is anyways aser, and at that point, once you do the Ktsira, it's going to be mutter. So again, the right girsa is that the Isser Achil of Chadash is until the Karban Omer was brought. The Isser Ktsira of Chadash really should have been until the Ktsira of the Karban Omer, but the way the Mishnah phrases it is up until Pesach. But again, the point of the Mishnah was that there's an Isser Achila and there's an Isser Ktsira. Inside the Isser Achila, inside the Isser Ktsira, and Negeya not only Sa'irin, but the Negeya all the Chameshes Minei Dagan. And the Gemara now is going to begin with the sources. How do we know that the Isser Achila of Chadash and the Isser Ktsira of Chadash are both Negeya, all 5 grains? As the Gemara, V'asurim b'Chadash, we have to change the Gersa, Milifnei Oimer. You know, what's in the card to this? Reish Lakish said, Asya lechem imatza. It says lechem with regards to this Chadash. And it says lechem oini in the parsha of matzah. And just like matzah is chameshes minei dagan, so too is a Chadash is chameshes minei dagan. For liktzar, Lifnei, again we have to change the girsa, ha-Pesach. The Issa Ktsira is up until Pesach, and it's true again for all 5 grades. Binani Mili, Rabbi Yochanan said, Asir Reishis Michala. It's learned out also from Gzeir Shava, not Lechem, but rather it's learned out from Reishis. It says Reishis by Chala, Reishis Arisa Sechem, and it says Reishis as well in the context of the Karban Omer, just like Chala, as the Mishnah said, is Negeya, all Chameshes Minei Dagan, so too when it comes to Chadash, it's going to be Negeya, all Chameshes Minei Dagan as well. So again, the summary of the first few lines of the daf, how do you know that the Isser Chadash, Sai Achila, Sai Ktsir is Negeya, not only Sa'irim, but it's Negeya, all Chameshes Minei Dagan, it's learned out from Gzeir Shabbos. The Isser Achila is learned out, Lechem Imatzah, Davar B'itay Matov, and Isser Ktsir is learned out, Reishis, from Chala. So the Mishnah had said, per the proper Gersa, that the Isra Achila of Chadash is up until the Karban Omer was brought. It says the Gemara, "My Kodim Omer." Which stage of the Karban Omer? Rabbi Yoina said, "Kodim Ktsiras Omer." It means up until the Ktsira of the Karban Omer. Rabbi Yosef Bar Zavda said, "Kodim Avas Omer." No, it's going to be us until the Karban Omer was brought. So, going backwards, Rabbi Yosef Bar Zavda says, what does it mean that the Isra Achil of Chadash until the Karban Omer was brought? It's what we always thought. It means until the Karban Omer was brought. What does it mean to bring a carbon? So this is a mincha. It means you have to be makta the mincha on the mizbeach. So until the hava of the Karban Omer, see Zvachim and Menachos for the definition of hava, the halach is there's going to be an Isra Chadash. Azoi halt Rabbi Yosef Bar Zavda. Rabbi Yoina said a chiddush. Rabbi Yoina said, you want to know what it means that the Isra Chadash is until the Omer? It means until the Ktsira of the Omer. Now Rashi speaks out. There's no way that the Ktsira of the Omer, which was done B'leil Tezayin, would be matter the Tfuah Chadasha. And this is really based on sugyas that we saw in the last several dafim. That's posh. You would have to wait until the day. So what then is Shitas Rabbi Yoina? Shitas Rabbi Yoina is that once it's Heir Pnei Mizrach, once the sun rises on Tezayin, at that point, as long as the Ktsiras Omer was done, it's going to be mutter. So you don't need to physically bring the Karban Omer. You need to do the Ktsira, but it's not the Ktsira alone that's going to do the trick. It's the Ktsira together with Heir Pnei Mizrach. Because if it wasn't Heir Pnei Mizrach, there's nobody in the world that holds that the Tfuah Chadasha is going to be mutter. So really, according to Rabbi Yoina, what the Mishnah is saying is Heir Pnei Mizrach is matter, albeit if you did the Ktsira of the Karban Omer, according to Rabbi Yosef Bar Zavda, you actually have to bring the Karban Omer. Says the Gemara. Let's see if there's a insight into this Machloikis minei ubein the Mishnah. Tanan, the Mishnah said asurim bechadash, and again we have to change the gersa over and over and over again. Lifnei ha'omer v'liktzar lifnei ha'pesach. So the Mishnah said that there's an issa chadash and there's an issa ktsira, but the expiration date of this isser, until when this Isser applies, is different for the Isser Achila, for the Isser Ketzira. According to the Mandama, that says that what does it mean that there's an Isser Achila until the Hava of the Omer? And we know that there's an Isser Ketzira until Pesach, which really means until the Ketzira of the Omer. Well, then I understand. I understand why the Mishnah made two categories. We made the Isser Achila, and we made the Issa Ktsira. We didn't lump them all together because they have a different Soif's man. The Soif's man Achila is the Havas Omer. The Soif's man Ktsira is the Ktsira of them. But according to the Mandama, that says, so what does it mean that there's an Issa Achila until the Omer means until the Ktsira Omer? Well, if that's the case, La'arvinu v'lisninu, then it's not really two categories because the Issa Achila and the Issa Ktsira are both up until the Ktsira. Well, if that's the case, we should have lumped them together, and what we should have said was Asurim b'chadash Achila. So why do we have two categories? We should lump them together. So if they have different soifs manim, then I understand. But if it's one soifs man, they're both totally in the ktsira, so shouldn't we put them together? Now Rashi speaks out. 1 second. Even though, according to Rabbi Yoina, the soifs man of Achila is ktsira, and the soifs man of ktsira is also ktsira, but it's not the same thing. And the reason is because we mentioned that even if you hold that ad ha'omer means ksiras ha'omer, you still have to wait until it's heir pnei mizrach. Until it's heir pnei mizrach, at that point there's nobody in the world that's going to hold that there's going to be a heter achila. As opposed to the ktsira, you don't need heir pnei mizrach. As soon as you do the ktsira, it's going to be okay. Which means that the soifs man achila, the soifs man ktsira are not one and the same. That's similar. They both don't require the hava of the omer, but one, the ktsira alein is matter, and in the other, it's the ktsira together with heir per mizrach. So was fragt the Gemara, larvinu v'lisninu, that would be true if it was literally one's man. Oh, but fragt Rashi, it's not really one's man. So Rashi says you have to say that even though it's true, it's not really one's man, but the Maksha holds it could be one's man. The reason it could be one's man is because what would be if the ktsira was done right before Heyer Pnei Mizrach? It was done very, very late at night. Well, at that point, as soon as the Ktsira is done, it's Heyer Pnei Mizrach, and now the Ktsira was Matter the Ktsira, because the Ktsira Alein is Matter the Ktsira, and it's Heyer Pnei Mizrach, and the Ktsira and Heyer Pnei Mizrach is Matter the Achila. So it's true, in the event that the Ktsira is done earlier in the evening, and the Heyer Pnei Mizrach is not happening for hours later, it would come out the Soif Zmanim are not the same. But there is a Hechet Timtza where the Soif Zmanim could be the same. And be that there's a Hechet Timtza where the Soif Zmanim could be the same, so freik the Gemara, larvinu v'lisninu. And now that's only a kasha if you hold that it's takatoli only in Heir Pnei Mizrach and the Ktsira. If, however, one is Ktsira, one's Achilas, that's two completely different Zmanim. So then, of course, there's no kasha. But the bottom line is, because of this kasha of larvinu v'lisninu, the Gemara says we have to revisit the Machlokes. There's no way Rabbi Yoina can hold what we think he held, because it's literally mufrach from the Mishnah. Eli itmar asefit. You have to say that we had a misunderstanding of the Machlokes, Rabbi Yoina, Rabbi Yosef bar Zavda. As a matter of fact, they weren't even arguing on this part of the Mishnah. They were arguing on the Mishnah, but a whole different part. Not the Reish of the Mishnah, but the Sefer of the Mishnah. What did the Sefer of the Mishnah say? So the last line of the Mishnah was, Im hishrishu koidem la'omer ha'oidem atira. That how do you know if something is considered part of this year's crop, so that the omer is going to be mattered? So the Mishnah said it's totally in the Ashrasha. If the Ashrasha happened already before the omer, then the omer is matter. If the Ashrasha didn't happen, then the omer is not going to be matter. You have to wait until the next omer, until it's mutter. On that line of the Mishnah, Vir the Amayram debated this point. My Koidem Loimer, what's the taich of Koidem Loimer? Rabbi Yoina. Rabbi Yoina said, Koidem Havas Hoimer. It's totally in the Havas Hoimer. Rabbi Yosef bar Zavda Hoimer, he said Koidem Ktsiras Hoimer. It's totally in the Ktsiras Hoimer. In other words, when we say, did the Hashrasha happen or not happen? At what point would you need the Hashrasha to have happened in order for the Omer to be matter? At what point of the bringing of the Korban Omer would you need the Hashrasha to have taken place? That's the Machlokes Rabbi Yoina, Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Zavda. According to Rabbi Yoina, it's the Hava of the Omer. If at that point the Hashrasha took place, you're good to go. According to Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Zavda, no, you would need the Hashrasha already happen b'shas the Ktiras Omer. That's what the Kaveh is. That's what they were arguing about. They were never arguing about the Soif Zman Achila of Chadash. That for sure is tali, not in the ktsira. That's for sure tali in the actual achila. It's muchach that way minei ubei in the Mishnah, because otherwise larvin of a lisnino. What then are they arguing about? They're arguing about a completely different part of the Mishnah, the seif of the Mishnah. This that hashrasha is kaveya. Is it hashrasha b'shas ktsiras omer, or is it hashrasha b'shas the hava of the omer? Either way, says the Gemara. Amar le Rabbi Lazar le Rabbi Yoshia the Dares. Rabbi Lazar told Rabbi Yoshia, who lived in his generation. Now, obviously, if Rabbi Lazar is talking to Rabbi Yoshia, he's talking to the Rabbi Yoshia of his generation. If you look at Rashi, Shahaya b'doiroi uben giloi lafuki Rabbi Yoshia agado shayatan. The only reason the Gemara is saying this is because there were two Rabbi Yoshias, and we want you to know Rabbi Lazar, the Amayra, is talking to Rabbi Yoshia, the Amayra. He's not talking about Rabbi Yoshia Hagadol, who was a Tan. But either way, this is what he told him. I do not want you to sit down. You cannot sit down until you explain the following thing to me. What do you need explanation? What's the makar to this idea that the carbon omer is matter tfuah that had hashrash? Meaning this halach of the end of the Mishnah. And this idea that permeated really the last few daf. This is one of the biggest ideas in the sugi of chadash. That the kaveh is hashrash. But it's hashrasha. So Rav Elazar asked Rabbi Yoshia, what is the source to this? There has to be some biblical source. This is what he wanted to know. So he told him back, Minallah, you want to know what the makar is? I'll tell you, because the pasuk says, the imtakriv minchas bikurim lashem aviv kaloi ba'esh geres karmel takriv eis minchas bikurecha. So this pasuk is discussing the minchas bikurim, and the pasuk says that the minchas bikurim had to be brought from aviv. Now aviv means that it's already ripened. Now, from the fact that the Torah says that it has to be brought from ripened tfuah, lav michlal deikad lav aviv, it sounds like that really you could have brought from something that's lav aviv. Kamash malon, then no, you have to bring from aviv. Here's the point. If anything that's not aviv, anything that's not ripe, is not part of the tfuah chadasha, then it's possible you can't bring the mincha from that tfuah. Because if you're being mater the chadash, you have to bring from the chadash in order to be mater. So if the definition of chadash, the definition of tfuah that's included in this sugya of the minchas bikurim, the carbon omer and the shtei alechem respectively, is dafka something that's fully ripened, well then it would be pashit that the minchas bikurim would have to be brought from aviv, and the reason is because if it's not aviv, it's not from the tfuah chadash, and that's pashit, you have to bring from the tfuah chadash to be matter the chadash. Zoy meres, from the fact that the Torah has to emphasize that, make sure it's aviv, that really tfuah chadash could be lav aviv. Oh, if it could be lav aviv, so as long as it's mushrash, as long as it was rooted, that would be enough for it to be considered chadash. But the Gemara asks the very obvious question. The Bach inserts the word vidulma. Oh, but vidulma the lav aviv. Maybe you're right. From the fact that the Torah says the minchas bikurim had to be aviv zayis meres, that the tfuah chadash could be considered even if it's not aviv. Oh, but ula olam da'il shlish. But maybe it has to grow a certain shear. What shear is shlish? So we know shlish is like a magic number in these agricultural sugyas. But the bottom line is, how do you know ashrash alone is enough? And a chanami doesn't have to be fully ripe, doesn't have to be aviv, but it has to be something. Ella Amar Shmuel. Shmuel said the makar is from somewhere else. It says v'chaga kotzer b'kurei masecha asher tizra basada v'chaga osiv. I'm sorry. It says shiva shavuos tispar lach mehachel chermesh bakama tachel lispar shiva shavuos. That after the carbon omer was brought, so he was supposed to count 7 weeks. When do you count the 7 weeks? It's mehachel chermesh bakama. It's from the time that the chermesh, so the chermesh is the sickle, began to do its thing with the standing grain. It's from that point. Now we see from here that the carbon omer had to be brought from something that you were able to use a chermesh for, meaning something that required a sickle. Now, why would the Torah have to tell me that it has to be from something that requires a sickle? If it doesn't require a sickle, well, that means that it's already so not ripened, that it's not even chadash. Lav michlal. What do you see from here? The ikka the lav bar chermish, that there is something that's not a bar chermish, and afilu hachi, it's going to be considered from the Tvua Chadasha. Well, if that's the case, you can't tell me that the only time it's going to be okay is if it brought a shlish already, because a shlish is a bar chermish, and you see from the fact that the Torah says that the minchas ha'omer had to be brought from something that's a bar chermish, that even something that's not a bar chermish is technically considered Tvua Chadasha. So you can't tell me that aviv lav michal the lav aviv is if it's ayel shlish, because I know from chermish that no, even if it's lav bar chermish, even if it's less than a shlish, for sure it would be okay. Or for sure it would be considered from the Tvua HaChadasha. Well, if that's the case, so what's less than a shlish? Mistama, if there's Ashrasha, that would be okay. But the Gemara says, and here too the Bach inserts the same exact word. The Dilma, the Lav Bar Chermish. Maybe you're right. You see from here that Tvua HaChadasha is considered even if it's not a Bar Chermish, but maybe it has to grow at least to the point where it's something. Again, it has to be something. Mechatesi. If all it has is ashrasha, that would be okay. But Rabbi Yitzchak said, I'll tell you why. Because it says, Mehachel kermish bar kama. Kama michal de lav bar kama. From the fact that the Torah says also it has to be from kama, that the omer was brought from standing grain, was also meres that really Tvua Chadasha could be even if it's not standing grain. Again, it's the same exact diak. If we're telling me that the Minchas Ha'omer had to be brought from Aviv and Chermesh and Kama, that means something that's not Aviv, something that is not subject to the Chermesh, something that's not even Kama, that in of itself would be okay. Now, Shachas at the very least is Kama, so it must be that there's even something that's less than Shachas that would be considered Tvua Chadash, and that's probably something that merely had Hashrasha. But the Gemara again says, and again the Bach inserts the word, V'dilma the lab bar Kama. Maybe you're right, Tvua Chadash could be even if it's not a bar kama, ubel agam. Kama means that it's able to stand straight. Agam would mean that you could bend it. So maybe it has to have more than hashrasha. Something grew, but it's flimsy. You'd be able to bend it. It's not kama, but at the same time, it's more than hashrasha. Elo, my Rava, Elo always means this is the end of the conversation. So Rava said, it says, Asher Tizra Mishazriya. From the fact that it says in the pasuk, V'chaga Kasa B'kurim Masech Asher Tizra Basada, V'chaga Asa B'tzeisa Ashana B'asabachol. So again, it says regarding V'chaga Katzer Asher Tizra Basada, and even though V'chaga Katzer, by the way, is talking about Shvuas, so that's more of a sugin, the Shtei Alechem, but the Shtei Alechem was Mater Chodesh, just like the Karban was Mater Chodesh. So it's really one sugya, but the bottom line is, you see clearly regarding the Shtei Alechem, so what in the Karban Omer, it's telling in the Shazriya, Shazriya, Hashrosh is going to be enough. But the Gemara has one follow-up question. Rapapa told Rava, it sounds like all you need is Shazriya. So Zriya is even before Hashrasha. So why is Zriya not enough? Why is the Kaveya Hashrasha? The Kaveya should be, well, you Zayreya. So the Gemara says, Amalei, Rav Papa was told by Rava, meaning Rava responded to Rav Papa and he told him, Sudni Basadik Sev. He said, Sudni, it says the word Basadik. If you take a look at Rashi says, what does it mean, Sudni? Rashi has a whole bunch of pshatim. One pshat, Rashi says, Talmidei Chachamim Akol Sudni, Al Shem Seid Hashem Li'Yereyev. Another pshat Rashi says is that we know Rav Papa used to make beer. And because Rav Papa used to make beer, so he had his secret recipe. He knew how to make in a way that other people didn't know. And it's for that reason, he was known as Sudni. Rashi says Sudna means Soidna Shemasheres. It's a Soidna that brings a person ashirs. But the bottom line is, Rava referred to Rav Papa as Sudni, and he told him that the answer to your question is, it says Basadek Sev. Asher Tizra Basada. Asher Tizra Basada means that you didn't just plant it, but Basada became a chefts of the Sada. And the only time it becomes a chefts of the Sada is when you plant it, but also it's rooted. But until the Ashrosh, it's not a chefts of the Sada. That's how you know that the Kaveya is going to be Ashrosh. Either way, what's the recap of the latter part of the daf? The Gemara brought the Makar, how you know that once something is already mushrash, it's considered chadash, and at that point the Karban Omer is going to be mater. It's learned out from the fact that it says regarding the Shtei Halechem, ironically, the Chag HaKatzer, Bikurei Masecha, Asher Tizra Basada, Asher Tizra Mishazriya, Basada, but it has to be part and parcel of the Sada, which would mean at the very least, there was already Ha'ashrash. Either way, the Gemara, or the Mishnah now, is going to discuss different halachos related to the Ktsira of the Karban. So we saw in the previous Mishnah that just like there's an Isser Achila of Chadash, there's also an Isser Ketzira of Chadash, stating that the Mishnah now is going to carve out a lot of times where it was mutter for one to do Ketzira, it was mutter for one to harvest the Tfuah HaChadasha even before the carbon omer itself was already harvested. Says the Mishnah, you're allowed to do Ketzira with the Tfuah HaChadasha in a Beis HaShlachim. So Beis HaShlachim is of the first Mishnah Masechtas my cotton fame. This is a field that's irrigated as long as it's deep in a valley. But although you're allowed to harvest, so you're allowed to go and cut the tfuah, but if you want to make bundles of the tfuah, that's something that's already not going to be okay. We're going to see in the Gemara. The reason Kaitzrim Beis Hashlachin Sheba Makim is because you weren't allowed to bring the Minchas ha'omer from a Beis Hashlachim. It was considered inferior quality schayra. And being that you weren't allowed to bring the carbon omer from there, so in Mela you don't have the Isser Chadash. The Isser Chadash is only from where you can bring the carbon omer. But being that you couldn't bring the carbon omer from there, it's not going to be a problem. So therefore, Kaitzim Beis Hashlachim, Avaloi Gaitzim, you're not allowed to go and make piles, and that's for a different reason. Chazal will geyser that if you're going to be goyish, you may come to eat it. Isra Achila, that for sure you do have, and it's for that reason Chazal said Avaloi Gaitzim. Anchi Yerichai, the people that lived in Yerichai, Kaitzim B'Tzayin Chachamim, they used to do Ketzira in the Beis Hashlachim, and that was B'Tzayin Chachamim. Mishnah just said it's mutter. The Gaitzim, they also were goyish. That was already Shalei B'Tzayin Chachamim, because we just said you're not allowed to do it. But even though it was Shalei B'Tzayin Chachamim, Michal B'Yad and Chachamim were in Meicher. Another halacha. Kaitzir l'shachas Michal B'Heimam. A person is allowed to do Ketzira l'shachas before the tfuah has ripened. So shachas is unripened tfuah. If he's using it to feed his behema. A lot more about this in the Gemara. Rabbi Yehuda said, when is the true? This is only true if the shachas didn't grow a shlish yet. Once it grew a shlish, it's going to be a problem. Rashi says, if you look at the lashon of Rabbi Yehuda, and from there it's mashma that as long as you start before it grew a shlish, even if later it grows a shlish, it's going to be okay. Rabbi Shimon says, Reb Shimon is not limited to the shlish. He says, no, even if it grew a shlish, it's still going to be okay. A lot more on this machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and Reb Shimon in the Gemara. Another time a person is allowed to do Ketzira, even before the Ketzira of the Omer, is if he's doing it mipnei netiyos. So if somebody has netiyos, in English, saplings, and amongst the saplings he has tfuah, and he wants to cut that tfuah, it's fine. And the reason is for the same reason we mentioned earlier, because you can't bring the minchas Omer from the tfuah that's b'toicha netiyos, so therefore there's no isek tzira. Additionally, mipnei beisa avil, mipnei bittul beisa medrash. In the event that there's a beisa avil and they have to have the suda of the avelim and they need place to sit, and the only way they can be able to have place to sit is by doing ketzira, that's mutter. Additionally, if they need a bis medrash, so that too, if the olim needs a place to sit, so you'd be allowed to do ketzira. And what's the reason that mipnei beisa avil, bittul beisa medrash is mutter? It's because of the mitzvah shabai, and being that we're dealing with a mitzvah, Rashi says Hani K'tzir Mitzvah Ninu, and it's for that reason it's going to be okay. Now, the Mishnah just gave a few times where it's okay for us to do K'tzira, specifically this last list. V'koitzir mipnei netiyos, mipnei beisa avil, and mipnei bittul beis medrash. Says the Mishnah, stating that in all these cases you're not allowed to make krichos bundles. Avol menichin tzvasim, you should leave them untied. Mitzvah omer lava min hakama. There's a mitzvah to bring the carbon omer from kama. Right? The pasuk says mehachel chermesh bakama. So from standing grain, like matzah. Let's say you couldn't find kama, then b'diavad yavim min ha'amarim. You could bring already from bundles. Mitzvah lavim min halach. There's a mitzvah to bring from moist tfuah. Loy matzah yavi yavich. You could bring from dry. Mitzvah liksa balayla. The mitzvah is to do the k'tzira by night, niktzah by yom kosher. If you did it during the day, it's going to be okay. If the k'tzira was done during the day, v'doiches haShabbos, the Gemara is going to discuss what is doiches Shabbos, but the omer, either the k'tzira, the hava, was doiches Shabbos, regardless. The Mishnah mentioned a whole bunch of different halachas related to the k'tzira of the carbon omer. It began by saying, Koitzrin beis hashlachin shebe'amakim. You're allowed to do k'tzira of the tfuah hachadasha in a beis hashlachim shebe'amakim, in an irrigated field that's deep, even before the k'tzira of the carbon omer. Avaloi goychem, you can't bundle it. Then the Mishnah said that the anshe Yerichai were koitzrim b'tzayin chachamim, the goychen shloi b'tzayin chachamim, meaning they were koitzrim and goychen. The Kaitzin was B'Tzayin Chachamas, the Mishnah says you're allowed to do it. The Kaitzin was Shalei B'Tzayin Chachamas, the Mishnah says you're not allowed to do it. Stating that the Chachamim were not Meicha. So the Gemara now is going to discuss everything that we just mentioned. Time. Abrais. Rabbi Yamin Oimes. You don't see Rabbi Yamin every day. Rabbi Yamin said, one pasuk says, you should do the Ktsira, bring the carbon Oimer. This pasuk is a little bit mashma that you could do Ktsira of Chadash before the carbon Oimer was brought. There's another pasuk that says, Reishis Ktsirchem alakoye. That no, the Reishis Ktsirchem has to be the carbon Oimer, which would imply you're not allowed to do Ktsira before the carbon Oimer. Okay, Tzadluchur, there's a stira. Said Rabbi Yamin, Mimakim Shata Mevi Yata Koitzer. Mimakim Shata Mevi Yata Koitzer. You know what the pasuk is coming to tell me? That there are times as an isik tzira, there are times as not an isik tzira. And it's totally in, am I being koitzer tfuah that I could bring the carbon oimer from or not? If the answer is yes, well then it's going to be us. That's reishis ktsirchem alakoy. If, however, I'm doing ktsira of tfuah that I can use as the carbon oimer, that's okay. That's uktsartem es ktsira, and afterwards vehevesim as oimer. And this is the mikar to the first halach of the Mishnah. We said, what's the reason? It's because he can't bring the carbon oimer from there. So what? It's because there's a pasuk that's coming to teach me that there is a het tzira as long as it's not from a place that you can bring the carbon oimer. But the Gemara asks a kach on Rabbi Yamin. How do you know that the way Rabbi Yamin was miyashiv the stiras apsukim is the accurate way? Maybe maybe what the pasuk means that sometimes there's an isik tzira, sometimes there's an hetek tzira is it a makkah from where you can bring the carbon oimer? Maybe that's not the koveya. The mokim is not what's gairim. Maybe it's the min that's gairim. If it's a min from where you can bring the carbon oimer, what was the carbon oimer brought from? Sa'irin, then reishis ksirchem alakoyin. Don't cut the first sa'irim for yourself, cut the first sa'irim for the carbon. If, however, it's something from which you can't bring the carbon oimer, then uktsartem es ksira ve'veisem oimer. So maybe the way you reconcile the psukim is to teach me that the isik ksira is only negeya sa'irin. What's the Gemara's teretz? The first part of the daf. The Gemara says, "Ahulei matzes amrit the Rabbi Yochanan." You can't say that because the Mishnah already said that all chameshes minim are negay the isik tzira, and Rabbi Yochanan had a makar to it. Gzeira shava reishis from chala. So once you have a gzeira shava, you have a makar. At that point, that's not an option. How then are you miyashiv the stira? Must be tali and makayim. That's the makar to the first line of the Mishnah. Now the Mishnah said, Anshe Yerichai were koitzim b'tzayin chachamim v'goychin shaloi b'tzayin chacham. So the Anshe Yerichai, they were koitzer and they were goydish from the Tfuah Chadasha in the Beis HaShlachim Sheba Makim. Now the Koitzrim part was B'tzayin Chachamim. The Goychem part was Shaloi B'tzayin Chachamim. But the Mishnah makes an emphasis and says, V'loi michu b'yadam, that the Chachamim were not moicha. The Gemara is going to begin, we'll speak this out Bal Peh, with a very subtle dik. It sounds like this was the situation where the Chachamim were not moicha and the Anshe Yerichai. As if to say there were other times that the Anshe Yerichai did things that were not okay, and the Chachamim were moicha. Meaning, why is that even a sugya? They weren't. It sounds like there's a sugya called where the Chachamim moicha and not moicha the Anshe Yerichai, as if to say the Anshe Yerichai were involved in different controversial practices, and we know the Chachamim were moicha on some and not on others. This is on the list of Eloi Michu B'Yadam Chachamim. This is the background to the Gemara's initial take on the Mishnah. Man's shamet leizok the Gemara to Amar Michu v'lei Michu. Who is the Tana and Shas who holds that there were interesting minhagim that Anshe Yerichai observed, and that sometimes the Chachamim were moicha and sometimes they were not moicha? Zok the Gemara Rabbi Yehuda. It's a Tana Rabbi Yehuda, and if that's the case, freit the Gemara Akasha v'sover Rabbi Yehuda ksirat Anshe Yerichai b'tzayin Chachamim havai. Is Rabbi Yehuda l'shitase of the opinion that when the Anshe Yerichai went ahead and did Kitsira, it was B'tzayin Chachamim. Does Rabbi Yehuda hold Koitzrim Beis HaShlachim Sheba Makim? Now it's the halach of the Mishnah, but Rabbi Yehuda is a Tanu Polik. Does Rabbi Yehuda hold it about Tanya we learned in a Brayso? In other words, the Gemara is suggesting that the Tanya of the Mishnah has to be Rabbi Yehuda, Mechatesi, because he's the one that has a sugya called with the Chachamim moicha, not moicha for this controversial practice of the Anshe Yerichai. The problem is that Rabbi Yehuda's sheet is you can't be koitze beis hashlachim sheba makim. As a matter of fact, the Gemara is going to prove that Rabbi Yehuda held that the Anshe Yerichai who were koitzim beis hashlachim sheba'amakim, like the Mishnah says, did that gufa shaloi b'tzayich chachamim, which would mean that at the time of Mishnah can't be Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda is the only one that we know has a sugya of were the chachamim moicha, not moicha anshe yerichai, and Rabbi Yehuda we also know has a sugya that when the anshe yerichai were koitzer beis hashlachim sheba'amakim, it was shaloi b'tzayich chachamim. So is the Mishnah Rabbi Yehuda, not Rabbi Yehuda? We have a big problem. So again, says the Gemara, the Sover Rabbi Yehuda considered anshe yerichai b'tzayich chachamim. Avoy v'tan we learned to the Brayso Shishat Dvarim. There were 6 things that the Anshe Yerichai did that were a chiddush. 3 of them were done b'tzayich chachamim, 3 were done shloi b'tzayich chachamim. The following were the ones that were done b'tzayich chachamim. Markivin de kolim kol hayom, and this is another incredible davar b'itay. They used to graft the kolim, palm trees, the entire day. Which day? Yud Dalet Pesach, Erev Pesach. So Erev Pesach, there's a major sugi in Shas, in fact, a whole parak in Shas, that discusses, could you do malacha, could you not do malacha? So we know it's totally a minig, parak, makom, shanag, masechtas, psachim, begins with this inyan, this minig, before chatzos, after chatzos. But the bottom line is, this is a sugya. Could you do malacha? Literally, can you work in your field Erev Pesach? So the Anshe Yerichai would be markiv the kolim the entire day. The rabbis even after chatzos. The korchen es shema. Additionally, they would bind shema. So what does that mean? It means they wouldn't be mafsik bein teva leteva. Specifically, if you look in the Gemara Masechtas Pesachim, the Gemara says they weren't mafsik between echad and v'yohafta. V'koitzer lifnei ha'omer. Additionally, they were koitzer beis hashlachim sheba'amakim even before the carbon was brought. Now these 3 things, even though they were chidushim, but it's b'rtzon chacham. The chacham were masking to these things. The following 3 things were done shalei b'tzon chachamim. Goitchen lifnei ha'omer. They weren't just koitzer, but they were also goitish. That we know shalei b'tzon chachamim. That's our Mishnah. Umatir and kamzeh shal hektish shal charvet shal shikma. Additionally, if they would prune carob trees and sycamore trees, charav and shikma respectively, that belonged to hektish, they would have hana from the pruned branches, and they didn't treat it as being hektish. Additionally, uparts and pirtzais, they would make holes in their fields and their gardens, and the reason they did it was to allow poor people in, so they would breach the fence. So anything that fell, the aniyim would be able to eat. During hungry years, they would do this on Shabbos and Yom Tov. You would think this is a beautiful thing, but this was actually also shalei ben tzayich chachamim. The reason is chachamim were afraid that the aniyim may come specifically and go on top of the tree and be kaitzer and end up doing malachas. The bottom line is the Anshe Yerichai did 3 things b'tzayich chachamim. These 3 things shalei b'tzayich chachamim. The 3 things that were b'tzayich chachamim was they would be markiv the kolim the entire Erev Pesach. They were mafsik bein teva and shema, and they were koitzer beis hashlachim sheba'amakim lifnei ha'omer. The 3 things that they did shaloi b'tzayich chachamim was they were goitchen lifnei ha'omer. They were nene from the pruned branches from the carob and sycamore trees of Hektish, and finally they would make these breaches in their fence to allow the aniyim to come and take tfuah that fell from the tree on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Divrei Rameir, these are the words of Rameir. Now notice, Rameir is talking about 6 things of Anshe Yerichai, 3 good, 3 bad. Doesn't say a word about macha. 3 were b'tzoin chacham and 3 were shalei b'tzoin chacham. Who's the one that has the sugya of a macha? We mentioned this 5 times in the beginning of this part of the daf. It's Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda told Rameir, in b'tzoin chachamim him oisen. If these 3 things that you just mentioned were b'tzoin chacham, you call adam oisen kain. How come everybody doesn't do it? I mean, the only people I know that do this or that did this were the Anshe Yerichai. If this was b'tzoin chacham, everybody should have done. Said Rabbi Yehuda, I have a different understanding of this Messiah. All 6 things, everything was shalei b'tzoin chacham. And the list is Val Shloisha Michu B'Yadam, Val Shloisha Loi Michu B'Yadam. Where there were 2 lists was 3 of these 6 things, 3 not. And by the way, my 6 is a different 6 as well. And Yehuda went and he said, first, the 3 things that were not okay, it was shaloi b'tzayich chachamim, but that the chachamim were not moicha. Number 1, markivin the kolim kalayot. Number 2, v'koitzrin eshma. So far, so good. Number 3, v'koitzrin v'goitchen lifnei ha'omer. This was shaloi b'tzayich chachamim, Sai Koitzrin and Sai Goitzrin. However, the Chachamim were Meicha. Elushem Yichabi and the following three were the ones that were Shaloi B'Tzayin Chachamim and that the Chachamim were Meicha. Matirim Gamzir Shal Hektish Shal Charv Shal Shikma. So far, so good. Uparts and Pirtzais began a saying, apart the Yasenkete Lahachal Nashal Ani B'Shnei B'Tzayin Shabbos V'Yom Tovim. Also so good. V'Nois Nepei Liyarik. And the third one was they would make payah even on Yerukas. Why is that a bad thing? The reason it's a bad thing is because pay is patim and amaisres. So essentially they were being mafkir Yerukas, which is not really subject to the laws of payah, from maisres. And those three things, the Chachamim went ahead and the Chachamim weren't moicha. The bottom line is, we have over here a machloikis Ramei Rabbi Yehuda regarding 6 things of the Anshe Richot. And these 6 were divided into 2 groups, 3 and 3, like the better 3 and the lesser 3. According to Ramei, the better 3 were 3 things that were done b'tzoin chachamim, the lesser 3 were things that were done shalei b'tzoin chachamim. According to Rabbi Yehuda, all 6 things were done shalei b'tzoin chachamim. The better 3 were the ones that chachamim weren't meicha, and the lesser 3 were the things that the chachamim weren't meicha. The bottom line is, in Rabbi Yehuda's list, we need Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda holds that one of the 3 things that the chachamim were not meicha was they were koitzrin v'goitchen lifnei ha'omer. Our Mishnah, koitzrin beis hashochem sheba'amachim and goitchen, chachamim weren't meicha. The Shiricha did both, like we have in our Mishnah, but the chachamim weren't meicha. The problem is that Rabbi Yehuda seems to hold very, very clearly that side the koitzim and side the goitchim were done shaloi b'tzayin chachamim. Well, if that's the case, Rabbi Yehuda can't be the Tan of our Mishnah, because our Mishnah said mefurish that the Anshe Richa were koitzim and goitchim, but the koitzim was b'tzayin chachamim and the goitchim were shaloi b'tzayin chachamim. So you'll tell me, okay, so who cares? Let the Tan of the Mishnah not be Rabbi Yehuda. Since when is that a problem? Masisim like Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, I'll tell you why it's a problem. Because the Mishnah is madgish that the chachamim weren't meicha on the goitchim, and the only one we know who has a sugya of moichin, not moichin, right? We appreciate the sugya moichin, not moichin after we see the machlokes from Rabbi Yehuda. So the only one who has such a sugya is the Tana Rabbi Yehuda. If that's the case, it sounds like the Tana of the Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda. If the Tana of the Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda, moichin, lav moichin, Rabbi Yehuda holds that Kaitzron was also shaloi b'tzayin chacham, not the halacha. The Mishnah. How do you make sense of the Mishnah? So the Gemara says, according to you, Shisha, Shiva Hava. I mean, you're asking a kasha. What's the lutamech? You're bringing this Rabbi Yehuda as a kasha. How are you going to now reconcile it with our Mishnah? This Rabbi Yehuda says, ain't Kaitzron, or Kaitzron was Shalei B'Tzayin Chacham, and the Mishnah says, Kaitzron was B'Tzayin Chacham. Well, according to you, Rabbi Yehuda has 7 things. Why do you have 7 things? Because the 3 things that were loy michuba Yadam was Markivin the Kolon Kalayim, Karchanas Hashma, Koitzrin, that's 1, Goitchin, so now already you have 4. And then you have the other 3 that the Chama were Meicha. The bottom line is you have 7. Said 6. How could it be 7? Elis, Mikan. You have to erase 1. Which one are we going to erase? It's easy. Ktsira. Oh, we're going to erase Ktsira. Everything is going to shift. Now, you have no Raya Minei Obey to erase Ktsira. But to make the Rabbi Yehuda Shtim, we're going to erase Ktsira. And if we erase Ktsira like this, Hakol Yavel Makayim Basham. So, the time of the Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda. If the Tana of the Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda, so don't you have a stira? Isn't Shitas Rabbi Yehuda that you're not allowed to be Kaitzer? No, Shitas Rabbi Yehuda is you're allowed to be Kaitzer. You said Mefurish that when the Anshe Richa were Kaitzer was on Shalei B'Tzayin Chachamim. That's if you have that Gersa. A Basami Mikan Ktsira. If you're Sami Mikan Ktsira, so obviously you're not going to have an ish. The Mishnah continued, and the Mishnah said, Kaitzer l'shachas u'meichel l'behema. Another example that one is allowed to cut the Tfuah HaChadash before the Karban was brought is in the event that he's Koitzer l'shachas u'meichel l'behema. So shachas is unripened Tfuah. So in the event that the Tfuah is not ripened, in that instance it's going to be okay. But the Mishnah adds, and this is going to be a big deal in the Gemara, u'meichel l'behema, which implies that the only time it's mutter even to cut shachas is if you're being meichel l'behema. The Mishnah then continued, and the Mishnah mentioned a machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and Reb Shimon with regards to the halacha of koitzel l'shachas. Rabbi Yehuda said, "Hey Masai, when is it true that you could be koitzel l'shachas? Bisman shemaschel ad shalehevi shlish." That's only if the tfuah didn't grow a shlish yet. And like we spoke out from Rashi in the Mishnah, that if it started the ktsira before it grew a shlish, then you can go weiter after it grew a shlish. But the point is, it has to be that it didn't grow a shlish yet. Reb Shimon said, "Yiktzar v'yachal af mishahavi shlish." No, it's okay even if it already grew a shlish. So machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and Reb Shimon in this halacha of koitzel l'shachas u'meichel l'behema, whether it's only true if it didn't grow a shlish yet, it's so shachas, it's so unripened, or even if it already grew a shlish. Says the Gemara, Tanan Hasam, we learned in the Mishnah over there, and where's there? So this is a Mishnah in Meseches Peah, Perek Beis, Mishnah Aleph. Ve'elu mafsikin lepeah. So the Mishnah over there is discussing what's considered a hefsek in a field with regards to the laws of Peah that would now make the two sides of the hefsek into two fields, and that would require the owner of the field to leave not one Peah but two Peahs. So we know what Peah is. A person has an obligation to leave the Peah of his field for the aniyah. The Mishnah over here says that there are times that there's something inside a field that can be deemed a division within the field, so that the two parts of the field will now be considered two individual fields, which would be mechayev two different payas. So the Mishnah says, what's an example of things that are mafsik? Hanachal, a stream. Vashlulis, Rashi says that's a body where rainwater has gathered, or a path that the yachid takes, or a path that the rabbim takes, or a shvil is like a derech, where again either the yachid takes or the rabbim takes, but only if it's kavua. And then the halach is that it be considered a hefsek b'mois achama during the summer, during the winter as well. V'habor, or if there's a area within the field that's completely fallow, there's nothing there. V'hanir, or there's an area that was plowed. Or if you have a field where you have one type of zera that's growing, and now in the middle there's a patch that's a zera achar, that's something else. Or v'koitza l'shachas is what we need in the event that somebody would go and he would be koitza l'shachas, mafsik, that too would be considered a hefsik. Divi rameir as I help rameir. The chachamim say as it relates to koitza l'shachas, ain't mafsik, it wouldn't be considered a hefsik. The only time doing work inside the field would be considered a hefsik is elam kem charash, only if you went ahead and you did charisha. But if you didn't plow it, all you did was koitzer, and you were koitzer l'shachas, that in itself is not going to be a hefsek. So the Mishnah gives a whole list of things that are mafsek l'peah, and then at the end of the list, the Mishnah mentions one controversial item. In fact, it's a matter of debate, a machlokes Rameir and the Chachamim. If somebody is koitzer l'shachas, he was koitzer the tfuah, he harvested the produce before it was fully ripened. According to Rameir, that's a hefsek. According to the Chachamim, that's not a hefsek. Now, what's the svara in Rameir? The svara in Rameir is that if a person is koitzer in the middle of a field, that can't make that area a hefsek to divide the field into two parts. And the reason is because being koitzer a field is part of what you do with a field. And being that it's part of what you do with a field, so that's just olam kimen hagay haylech. It's not like some weird thing that you have in the middle of your field. If, however, you koitzer l'shachas, that's not considered a ktsira. And being that that's not considered a ktsira, so now we view what's in the middle of the field as being a hefsek, and it's for that reason Rameir holds that too would be mafsek l'peah. So whatever's on one side of where you were koitzer l'shachas would have a chiyav peah, whatever on the other side would also have a chiyav peah. The Chachamim say no, ain't mafsek. Even when you're koitzer l'shachas, it's not going to be considered hefsek. If you plow a field, so that's already a whole different inyan. But being koitzer l'shachas, not. Says the Gemara. Amar Rabba bar bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabba bar bar Chana said the name Rabbi Yochanan. Rameir b'shitas Rab Shimon Amra. This Rameir is going with the shita of Rab Shimon in our Mishnah. What Rab Shimon say in our Mishnah? That it's mutter to be koitzer l'shachas before the carbon omer was brought, or before the ktsira of the carbon omer. And there was machlokes, but we do Rab Shimon, is that true only if it didn't bring a shlish yet, or even if it was already a via shlish? And Rab Shimon said, Yiktza v'yachal af mishe via shlish. Alma, what do you see for Rab Shimon? Kol l'shachas av ktsira. That as long as it's unripened, it doesn't matter if it has a shlish or doesn't have a shlish. Either way, it's not considered a ktsira. And that's why, even though it says in the Torah, Reishis ktsirchem has to be lakoyin, and has to be for the avodah, but this is not considered a ktsira. Oh, Reb Shimon holds that the ktsira of shachas is not considered a ktsira. That is literally shitas Rameir. Rameir holds that the ktsira of shachas is not considered a ktsira. Therefore, that area that you were koitzel l'shachas becomes a hefsek. It's mafsek l'peah. Even though regular ktsira not, what's the chiluk? A regular ktsira is a ktsira. Hence, it's considered part of what you do at the field, as opposed to ktsira l'shachas is not a ktsira. Hence, it's an anomaly. It's not something that you do at the field. In other words, the side of shitas Rameir is that a ktsira l'shachas is not a ktsira. It's literally shitas Reb Shimon. From the fact Reb Shimon says, Yiktzer v'yachol af mishe v'ya shlish kol l'shachas, any example of shachas, even if it's already a v'ya shlish, is considered lav ktsira. Hence Reb Meir and Reb Shimon amru davar echad. So this is what Rabba bar Bachana said over in the name of the great Rabbi Yochanan. So the Gemara says, Yosef Rabba v'kamer lo lahashmaita. So Rabba was sitting, he said over what? Rabbi Bar Chana said in the name of the great Rabbi Yochanan, Isvei Rav Acha Bar Huna le Rava. So Rav Acha Bar Huna was there, and he turned to Rav and he asked him a question from a brisa. Ach l'chagav. In the event that, again, a person has a field, and we're trying to figure out what's considered a hefsik le'inyan peah. So if grasshoppers would go and would eat from this field, by the way, this is another inyana deyayma, kirsamu nemalim, or if nemalim, ants would go and would eat part of the field, or shavas ruach, or the wind would destroy part of the field, hakol moedim, everybody would agree that charash mafsik, that in the event that he was also chayrish, it would be considered a hefsik, but like charash ain't mafsik, but if he wasn't chayrish, it wouldn't be considered a hefsik. In other words, the Brisa says that when it comes to grasshoppers, ants, or wind making some sort of destruction, everybody agrees that's not a hefsik. If you chayrish, it's a hefsik, not. Now, said Rav Acha Bar Huna, when the Brisa says hakol moedim, who does the Brisa mean? Hakol moedim man. Rameir, must be Rameir. Meaning, even though Rameir holds that ordinarily a kaitza l'shachas is a hefsik, but achla chagav kirsamu nemalim and shavra saharuach is not considered a hefsik, and that's why even Rameir's maida to what the Chachamim said. What the Chachamim say in the Mishnah, charash in loy charash loy, according to Rameir, that would be the case when it comes to a chag of nemalim and shavra soharuach. But the Gemara says, and this is Rav Acha Bar Huna talking, asking to Rava on what Rabbi had said over in the name of Rabbi Bar Chana, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, says, I don't understand why Rameir would be maida. Why? If when Rameir in the Mishnah said koitza l'shachas is considered a hefsek, it's talking about where the shachas was lo hivia shlish, then I would understand why the brisa is different, because we're making a kimta brisa the charashin lo charash lo b'shehevi shlish is talking about where it was hevi shlish. Being that it was hevi shlish, it's considered a ma'aseh k'tzira. If it's considered a ma'aseh k'tzira, then you would have to be chayrish. Eli amr masisa nami b'shehevi shlish. But according to where Rabbi Chana said the name Rabbi Yochanan, as recounted now by Rabbi, that Rameir is b'shitas Reb Shimon. If Rameir is b'shitas Reb Shimon said that a koitzel l'shachas is not considered a ktsira, even where it's me'aviyah shlish. That means Rameir also holds that it's even where aviyah shlish. That lach is it's not going to be considered a ktsira. Well, if that's the case, I don't understand. Hashta madach u'ma hasam over there. The ktsira madach there where you did a proper ktsira. Rameir lo yishma ktsira is not considered a ktsira. So hach over here, where you didn't do a proper ktsira, like kolshkein, it shouldn't be considered a ktsira. In other words, Rav Acha Bar Huna said that this brisa that says ach lo chagav kirsamu nemalim shavas haruach hakol moedim, that it's not considered a hefsek, is obviously Rameir. He's the hakol moedim, which means that even though Rameir says a koitzel l'shachas is considered a hefsek, this is considered a hefsek. And Rav Acha Bar Huna said there's no way in my mind to be able to make sense of this. How could it be a koitzel l'shachas is a hefsek, as opposed to these things are not a hefsek? Let's explain it a little bit better. Why does Rameir hold a koitzel l'shachas as a hefsek? Because it's not a k'tzira. What do you mean? It's not oilam kimin hagah haylach. It's just some strange thing. If the farmer goes with all his farming tools and he's koitzel l'shachas, it's not considered a ktsira. Why? Because it's in a state of shachas. So you're going to tell me that achla chagav kirsamu nemalim shavar soharuach over there it's going to be different? It's not possible. There's no way in the world that should be considered a ma'aseh k'tzira. If this is not a ma'aseh k'tzira, then there's no way that's a ma'aseh k'tzira, because that was done by grasshoppers. It was done by nemalim, right? It was done by the ruach. There's no way in the world. What must the teretz be? The teretz must be that the only time Rameir said that the halach is that a koitzel l'shachas is not considered a ma'aseh k'tzira is when it didn't grow a certain stage yet, where it was lo hiviyah shlish. If it was lo hiviyah shlish, so it's so unripened, so that's not considered a k'tzira. In the event, however, it was hiviyah shlish, at that point, the k'tzira is going to be considered a k'tzira. But if you're going to tell me the Rameir holds that the koitzel l'shachas is not considered a k'tzira, even where it's a v'yashlish, so if when the farmer does it, it's not considered a k'tzira, kal v'chaymer, when the chagav and the nemalim and the ruach does it, shouldn't be considered a k'tzira. So how would you be able to make sense of Rameir being maida in that case? It has absolutely no havana. And this, said Rav Acha Bar Huna to Rava, is akasha on what Rabbi said in the name of Rabbi Bar Chana, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, which is that Rameir is b'shitas Reb Shimon, as if to say Rameir said as Allah imur it's a via shlish. I think from this price it's muchach. He said it only where it's lo via shlish. Where it's a via shlish, avada, it would be considered oilam kimen hagay hoylach. It wouldn't be considered a hefsek. In fact, even a chagav nemalim and shavasu ruach would be considered not to be a hefsek. Either way, so the Gemara says that because of this, Ella, you have to say, Rameir, that what Rabbi Bar Chana meant in the name of Rabbi Yochanan was that Rameir, not Beshitas Rab Shimon Amra, but rather Beshitas Rab Yehuda Amra. Just the opposite. Rameir is going Beshitas Rab Yehuda. Ta'ama, what did Rab Yehuda say? Rab Yehuda was chaylik with Rab Shimon in the Mishnah. He said, a Masai, when is it true that you're allowed to be koitzer l'shachas before the carbon omer is brought? It's bismancha hischal. That's only if you started actually heavy shlish. Aval hischal ach heavy shlish. But if you started after it was already heavy shlish, aser, at that point it's going to be aser. That's precisely Shitas Rameir. Like we just proved from Rameir in the Mishnah and the Bryce, and the way we reconcile it must be Rameir holds that a koitzel shach is not considered exira only if it's like shlish. So fakert, and now we're going to say that Rameir was makbid on shlish. Thus, Rameir is not Beshitas Rab Shimon, just the opposite. Rameir is Beshitas Rab Yehuda. But the Gemara asks one more kasha. Ema deshamalei the Rab Yehuda. It's true that you see Rab Yehuda holds that a koitzel l'shachas is not considered a ksira if it's like heavy shlish. But when did Rab Yehuda say a koitzel l'shachas is not considered a ksira? That's the behema. La'adam mishametle. He only said it l'chayra if you're being koitzel behema. You didn't say it if you're being koitzel adam. The im came, because if you're going to tell me you said it even when you're being koitzel adam, havalu tlasa tanai. Then what would emerge is in our Mishnah that there are really three shitas, and in the Mishnah there's only two shitas. What does that mean? So we made this diak when we learned the Mishnah. We made the diak when we started the Gemara. The Mishnah said koitzel l'shachas. You can be koitzel l'shachas u'meichel behema. Be meichel behema. It was very clear that this halach is only true that you could be koitzel l'shachas if you be meichel behema. But if you be meichel adam, then already not. Now, Rabbi Yehuda commented on that. He said, "A maseh bezman shemas chalach lehevi shlish." Rav Shimon was chaylik. He said, "Af mishehevi shlish." But the Gemara is tining that it has to be that there are really two shitas in this Mishnah. Meaning, Rabbi Yehuda and Rav Shimon are being chaylik in the Tanakama. They're not arguing with the Tanakama. Now, if you're going to tell me there are meirs b'shitas Rabbi Yehuda, that means that Rabbi Yehuda didn't say his halacha only where it was being Meichel Behema. He said it even if you're being Meichel Adam. Why? Because Rameir said it where you're being Koitzel L'Shachas, even you're Meichel Adam. He didn't make a distinction between Meichel Adam and Meichel Behema. And if Rameir and Rabbi Yehuda is B'chodesh Shita, then if that's Shita's Rameir, that would also have to be Shita's Rabbi Yehuda. Well, if that's the case, it would emerge then that there are three Shitas in the Mishnah. How so? Koitzel L'Shachas and Meichel Behema. You could only be Meichel Behema, that's Shita number one. Rabbi Yehuda holds a Maseh B'zman Shemas Chalach Lehevi Shlish, that it's true even if you're Meichel Adam, albeit if it's Lehevi Shlish. And Reb Shimon, who probably, being that he didn't say the words Meichel Behema, is like Rabbi Yehuda, is going to say Yiktzer v'yachol af mishevi shlish even for Meichel Adam. But what's going to emerge is that you're going to end up having three shitas. If Rameir and Rabbi Yehuda chadash shita, then you're going to have three shitas in the Mishnah. Now, Kana ben Shoyel, so what's wrong? Why can't you have three shitas? What's geht techon if you have three shitas? So Rashi says, I'm going to tell you what the problem is. The problem is a Gemara in Sanhedrin, Daf Chof Hei Amud Aleph, that says, Kol Makom Sheshanu Rabbi Yehuda Emasai Enoi Elo Lefarish. Wherever he says the word Emasai is coming to be Mefarish. If he says Bama, then he's coming to be Chaylik. But the word Emasai is being Mefarish. And over here he said Emasai. So if he says Emasai is being Mefarish. So for sure, there's three shitas over here. There's two shitas over here. There's not three shitas. If there's only two shitas, that means Rabbi Yehuda is being Mefarish the Tanakama. That means Rabbi Yehuda also holds Koitzel L'Shachas only works if you're being Meichel Behema. That means it can't be Shittas Rameir. Because although Rameir and Rabbi Yehuda and they're both saying something very similar, eerily similar, they're both talking about this Indian of being Koitzel L'Shachas and not be considered a Ksira. But according to Rabbi Yehuda and the Mishnah, who's being Mefarish the Tanakam, it's only true if you're being Koitzel L'Shachas to be Meichel Behema. Whereas according to the Chachamim, it's going to be true, or according to Rameir, I should say, in the Mishnah Masechtes Pei, it's going to be true, even if you're being Meichel Adam. So first, the Gemara thought that maybe Rameir is b'chadashita with Reb Shimon, and the Gemara said it can't be because of the under Braisa of Rameir. Then the Gemara thought maybe Rameir is b'shitas Rabbi Yehuda. But the Gemara says it can't be, because Rameir is talking about even being Meichel Adam, and Rabbi Yehuda said a Masai, which means he's being Mefarish Tanakama. He's only saying it if you're being Meichel Behema. So the Gemara says, Elo ki yasir Rav Dimi. So Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, and he repeated ki yadu, a lot of things that he heard in Eretz Yisrael, specifically from the great Rabbi Yochanan. Amar, he said that, you want to know what Rabbi Yochanan said? Rameir b'shitas Rabbi Akiva Rabbi Yomra. Rameir wasn't going b'shitas Reb Shimon. Rabbi Meir wasn't going b'shitas Rabbi Yehuda. Rather, he was going b'shitas Rabbi Akiva. And again, he wasn't going b'shitas Rabbi Shimon because Rabbi Meir clearly holds that the only time a koitzel l'shachas is not considered a ktsira is if it's lo hiviyah shlish. But once it's hiviyah shlish, at that point not. Rabbi Shimon said mefurish in the Mishnah, a koitzel l'shachas is not a ktsira even when it's hiviyah shlish. He's not going b'shitas Rabbi Yehuda because Rabbi Yehuda said that the only time a koitzel l'shachas is not considered a ktsira is if he did a l'maychel behema. Rabbi Meir holds even it's l'maychel adam. So whose sheet is he going like? The sheet of Rabbi Akiva, who said afla adam namili avi ktsira, that a koitzel l'shachas even l'adam is not considered a ktsira. What's the makar to this time we learned in the Mishnah? And this Mishnah is also Masechtas Pei Perek Gimel Mishnah Beis. Similar case what we were discussing earlier. If somebody turns his field into a leopard, and he left rows of kalachim that were moist. So what's the case? The case is where somebody has a field that has rows and rows of tfuah, and he went ahead and he plucked every other row. So he left one, and the other one he was koitzer. Rabbi Akiva says that being that you have gaps of rows, each row is considered an individual field, and he has a chiyuv to give pay for each individual one. The Chachamim say no, it's considered one field, and you only give one pay. This is what we need to review this in the name of Shmuel. Then when Rabbi Akiva said pay l'chalecha ve'echad, like chayiv Rabbi Akiva, the only time Rabbi Akiva said you're going to be chayiv is ela b'minamer. It's only if the things that you took out l'kloyas. Now, apparently, when somebody was koitzel l'kloyas, he would use shachas. He would use tfuah. Rashi says, not only is shachas, but lo hiviyah shlish. So if you took it out l'kloyas, so then it's considered a hefsek. Each row now becomes an individual field. If someone's menamer to store, and when people were menamer la'itzer, they were menamer after it was already fully ripened. That's what you're putting. You're not putting away something unripened. You're putting away things that are ripened. Loy, in that case, it's not going to be considered a hefsek. But what do you see from here, says Rav Dimi? You see from here that Rabbi Akiva holds that if somebody is koitzer shachas, it's not considered a ktsira, meaning it creates a hefsek, and even if it's l'maychel adam, which is exactly shitas Rameir. Rameir's shita is that a koitzel l'shachas, even l'maychel adam, is considered not being a ma'aseh ktsira. Where do you see it in Rabbi Akiva? Because he said menamer l'kloyos, who eats kloyos? People eat the kloyos. So says Rav Dimi that Rabbi Yochanan didn't mean b'shitas Rab Shimon, because Rab Meir said it only where it's lo yiviyah shlish. Rab Shimon said it even where it's yiviyah shlish. He didn't mean Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda said only by Michael behema, and he said even by Michael Lot. He meant Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is talking about menamer l'kloyos. It's lo yiviyah shlish, and it's Michael Adam. Bingo. But the Gemara asks one kasha, Eini v'kas Ravin am Rabbi Yochanan. When Ravin came, he said the name Rabbi Yochanan a little bit differently. Mechayiv hay Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva used to say Yechayiv af b'menamer lo'itzer. So Rav and Rabbi Yochanan is saying something different, not than what Rav Dimi Rabbi Yochanan said, even though maybe indirectly he is, but on what Rav Yehuda Mashmul said. Rav Yehuda Mashmul said, "Lechayv Rabbi Akiva el menamem l'klayos, aval menamem lo'itzer loy." Rav and Rabbi Yochanan said, "Lechayv Rabbi Akiva af menamem lo'itzer." But what do you see from here? You see from here that according to Rabbi Akiva, if somebody would go ahead and he would be menamer, even if it's lo'itzer, still the halacha would be that you would be chayiv al kol achas v'achas. Well, if that's the case, menamer lo'itzer is being menamer where it was already bishel kol tzarkai, right? And by the way, it's for sure more than shlish. And we know Rameir only said his halacha by koitzel l'shachas, and even then only where it's lo hiviyah shlish. But according to Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, it's not shitas Rameir. Yeah, you see this musig of being koitzel l'adam, but it's koitzel l'adam even where it's a situation where it's more than shlish. In other words, according to Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, you see in Rabbi Akiva more than Rav Meir. Rav Meir holds that the only time it's not considered a ktsira is if you're koitzel l'shachas, albeit even l'maychel adam. In Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, you would see that Rabbi Akiva held even more. So the Gemara says that according to this, you would have to say savale kavasa b'chada or palagala b'chada. The Tana de Messiah for Rav Meir would still be Rabbi Akiva, but savale kavasa b'chada palagala b'chada. How so? Savale kavasa b'chada, that there's a concept of a ktsira not being considered a ktsira, even where it's l'maychel adam, not like reading Reb Shimon in the Mishnah where it seems like it's only b'maychel behema. Palagala b'chada, Rabbi Akiva holds it's true even if it was bishal called tzarkai, whereas according to Rameir it's only going to be true if it was loy hiviyah shlish. So the bottom line is the topic of the very, very last part of the daf was the next line of the Mishnah, koitzel l'shachas u'maychel behema. There's an idea that if someone's koitzel l'shachas, it's not considered a ktsira. And our Mishnah was negay the halachis of the Isser to be Koitzer Tfuah Chadasha before the Ktsira Sa'imer. Koitzer L'Shachas is not considered a Ktsira. In that instance, it's going to be okay. In the Mishnayos and Masechtas Peya, it's Negeya, where if somebody does a Ktsira in a field, but it's not considered halachically a Ktsira, it would create a hefsek in the field. So now this field would be chayiv in multiple payas, potentially. What emerges is a whole bunch of different shittas. Number one, in our Mishnah, it would seem that the only time a koitzer l'shach is not considered a ktsira is only if you're koitzer l'maychal behema. Additionally, machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon is it true only if it was lo yavia shlish, even if it was yavia shlish? From the Mishnayos and Masechtas Peya and the Gemara's discussion, aside from Shittas Rameh, aside from Shittas Rabbi Akiva, it would have seemed that even if the ktsira was done l'maychal adam, even then it could be, it's not considered a ktsira. According to Rameh, only if it was lo yavia shlish, and according to Rabbi Akiva, there's even a musig where if it was already bishul called sarkai, even at that point there would be a concept that in the event that somebody did some sort of ktsira, could be it would render a hefsek in the field. But the bottom line is, the latter part of the daf, the majority of the daf, discussed the Mishnah, which mentions different times where it's actually mutter to do ktsira before the Tfuah Chadasha. So in the Isser Chadash, there's an Isser Achila, there's also an Isser Ktsira, but there are carve-outs, there are times that it's mutter. Mishnah gave a whole list. We went through Be'in, two of them today. Be'in, meaning Daf Yomi Dik Be'in. Number one, there's an idea that a person's allowed to be koitzer beis hashlochim shebe'amokim, whole discussion about the Anshe Yerichai. And number two, a person is allowed to be koitzer l'shachas, also a major machlokes Tanam in terms of the nuances of how you apply this halach.